Politics isn't abstract when it's your school district, your hospital, your commute, your paycheck. In District 38, decisions made at the State House ripple straight into everyday life. They show up in classrooms in Delphi, on roads in Tipton and Camden, in small businesses in Roosevelt and Galveston. And the quiet question families ask all across this district, is anyone actually listening? This district isn't one story. It's growing suburbs near Lafayette, deeply rural communities and towns that feel forgotten until election season rolls around. Tonight, we're not here for slogans or party talking points. We're here to talk about responsibility, priorities, and what representation is supposed to look like when the job is about service, not ambition. So we're sitting down with someone who's asking for your vote, and more importantly, your trust. The question isn't whether the system is working. You already know the answer to that. The question is who's willing to change it and how. Let's get into it. Joining me today is Nate Stout, Democratic candidate for Indiana State House District 38. He comes from long career in private sector and is running on the idea that state government should work for everyday Hoosiers, not just the well-connected or well-funded. His district spans a wide cross-section of Indiana life, from growing suburban areas near Lafayette and deeply rural communities across Carroll, Cass, Clinton, and Tipton counties. We're going to talk about education funding, rural health care, infrastructure, economic opportunity, and what accountability actually looks like in a legislature that's been dominated by one party for a long time. This isn't a puff piece. This isn't a gotcha session either. It's about giving voters real answers, real priorities, and a real sense of how a candidate thinks when the cameras aren't just there for applause. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Derrick. I appreciate the opportunity to answer your questions. And like you said, take accountability for what's happening in Indianapolis and take a new approach at solving problems. That's as simple as it gets.
You've said you want government to work for all of us. What specific policies do you plan to champion in the Indiana House to address the unique needs of rural communities in Tipton, Carroll, Cass, Clinton, and Tippecanoe counties?
So I have several examples, but I think one of the things I wanted to point out is how I plan on running the district. It is, like you mentioned, it's parts and two whole counties of 6 counties in total, two whole counties. The amount of knowledge that you would need to have to understand the unique challenges, while you can say there are some similarities between those smaller towns, like you mentioned, the areas by Battleground, those are having different issues than somewhere like in Windfall. I want to have a district council where I have representatives from each of those counties that serve as a sounding board for, okay, what should be the priorities? My campaign has a separate list of 3 priorities, which are healthcare, restoring funding to public education, and economic development focused on small business. But getting a wider set of opinions and inputs for the decisions that I make are one of the things that I want to do differently.
Public schools in smaller towns like Flora and Roosevelt often face funding challenges. What ideas do you have to make education funding more equitable across District 38 school systems?
One of the things that I want to advocate for is some of the deregulation of public education funding. One thing that I'm learning more about as I move from the private sector into public service, we spend a lot of time and money that has to be designated for certain things. So, for example, capital improvements and deferred maintenance. Every school budget has some sort of rule onto how you can spend X amount of dollars from the current year budget. I think we should let communities be in more, have a more autonomy over the decisions they make for their school districts. Because as we mentioned, while there are similarities between the different cities in the district, everyone has a unique challenge. And I think that we should trust the people that are in leadership to make the decisions that are right for the community, not just because the line item budget says you need to spend 150,000 on a new football field or something like that.
Access to healthcare is a concern in many rural parts of Indiana. How would you work to improve healthcare availability and affordability for families in Delphi, Michigan town, and surrounding areas?
I would like to take something from the private sector and apply it to government, which are standardized metrics. And you hear KPIs, key performance indicators. There should be a kind of minimum level of service that we as Hoosiers agree upon. That hey, if you live in the country, we should try to make it convenient for. We should have a reasonable amount of time to access services. Certainly, people choose to live in the country, but sometimes that lifestyle chooses them, right? Maybe they grew up on a family farm and mobility isn't an option because that's where their business is. I want to take a metric approach to what does the service area look like for each city in the district? Where are some areas overperforming, like where they have more care in one area? And how can we learn, whether it's through a grant request, but really start to collaborate across the district to make sure that we have a minimum level of care that we all can agree to.
Economic opportunity is critical for Tipton and surrounding towns. What strategies would you support to attract higher paying jobs and support small businesses in the district?
Well, I think that we are actually on the precipice of a huge entrepreneurial boom. I think that the means or the barriers to entry in a lot of business have come down over the years with technology. Certainly, the internet has changed everything. But when it comes to economic development, we have to ensure that the deals that we are getting are beneficial, not just because it looks good and it's Amazon or it's Google. There's a lot of big brand names that catch a headline, but we just need to be smarter about where we're going to find employers. There's no reason, or there's a reason why Amazon and Google are coming to place data centers everywhere, because relatively speaking, our land is inexpensive. And especially as you get into some of these towns in District 38 that have kind of fallen behind, that land keeps getting cheaper. So we got to protect our assets, which is our area, and invest and attract companies with the incentives that you normally do in government. But you also have to make sure that there is an immediate return. I was just having this conversation today that a small business of 20 or 30 employees that's doing $3-5 million in revenue, that could significantly change a town like Tipton or a town like, Rocheville. So I want to make sure that our efforts to attract new business are more focused on remote work. We got to take advantage of this remote work boom. We got to find ways to bring co-working spaces where they make sense, and just become a draw for companies that are going to bring additional high-paying jobs, not just take our resources.
Nate, you have decades of experience in corporate America. How will that business background influence your approach to state budgeting and economic policy?
Well, I think certainly what I just mentioned about some of the big brand names, I think that I will be more equipped when a Google or an Amazon puts together a proposal to make sure that we're getting a fair shake. I think sometimes in state government, they have some very high caliber people working for them. And I think sometimes, they're looking out for their best interest. And I have the experience of knowing what that's like, and I want to do that on behalf of the citizens when we're doing economic deals.
Rural infrastructure like roads, broadband, and water systems matters for both residents and local businesses. What are your priorities for improving infrastructure in District 38?
So obviously, there are certain things that we can influence, and one thing that I want to do a better job of is collaborating with other elected officials throughout the district, because obviously county funds can vary, but certainly any opportunities for state grants, just like on my business side, you have to build a great foundation to build a great business. And cities and towns that are going to thrive, if they don't have a solid foundation in terms of infrastructure, we just limit their ability to grow and adapt. So I want to make sure that not only are we taking advantage of all these state funded programs, but we're working cross county to figure out a way that we can work together to leverage sometimes what are resources that are diminishing.
Housing affordability and quality can vary across your district. What specific policies would you pursue to help families who struggle with housing cost or conditions?
And again, some of this it's multifaceted, because there are federal and state programs that, we certainly have to lean on and use appropriately. But when it comes to legislation, I think that we all could agree on what's fair in a lot of cases. And I would like to see us put things to referendum votes. When it comes to what's reasonable when it comes to access and affordability and housing, I feel like we should come to the people and get some of their input. They're the ones living these experiences. I do know that there's some horror stories of landlords who have done some pretty sketchy things, and the rights of the renter aren't always prioritized. So it's a multifaceted answer, but ultimately that is, housing is a foundational issue that we got to make sure our counties and cities address.
Community engagement is often cited as a priority on your campaign site. How would you ensure that voices in smaller communities like Camden or Galveston are heard in the capital?
So I look at this in two ways. One, physically, I plan on being around the district as much as possible. I think, I have a sales background, and one of the biggest issues for salespeople when you go talk to a customer, they really hate it when their salespeople don't show up and they don't check on them. And whether it's through community events, one of the things I'm going to do throughout the campaign is just have what I'm calling office hours, where I say, hey, on this Saturday, I'm going to be at like the Love Bug Cafe in Tipton, or I might be at One More Cup in Burlington. And be accessible to people in those markets, that if they want to come talk, that I'll be there and be happy to stay and answer their questions. But then the second part of this is also the district councils. You know, they aren't official positions per se, but I want to make sure that I do have someone that's, up in the Delphi area that understands what's going on in education, because that might be different than the person in Tipton County. So that district council, I think, will set me apart in terms of getting more perspectives heard across the district.
What role should state government play in addressing issues like mental health and addiction, especially in rural parts of the district?
Well, I think with the opioid epidemic, that caused a lot of generational issues and traumas. And those are, I look at government as we are all Hoosiers, and we all got to make sure that, we're taking care of each other. And having access to mental health services is extremely important, especially in rural Indiana. Farmers have one of the highest suicide rates across any occupation. And, as a grandchild of a farming family, there's a reason for that. And I think that, in a time where, especially politically, you could look at it a couple different ways. Either you think the world's spinning out of control, or you're having, disagreements with family over politics. That's stressful. And we got to make sure that access is available as possible. I know a lot of programs have been cut. So one of the things that I am going to spend my first year doing is going back to see what was undone, because I know we've made a lot of strides in terms of mental health care access. It's been kind of a bipartisan issue in Indiana, but yeah, it's definitely one of those things that we got to prioritize.
Given the varied needs across District 38, from the outskirts of Lafayette to the smallest farming communities, how will you balance urban adjacent concerns with deeply rural issues in your legislative agenda?
Well, I think because of my kind of three pillar approach, education, funding, healthcare, and economic development, they're so foundational in terms of where they are in development and government development. They become kind of nonpartisan and also geographically independent. Because whether you are, in those urban areas or you're in this remote farm town, we need to have solid public education. And I think what we're seeing, not to get off the subject, but with the school vouchers, we've abandoned a lot of communities, and places like Tipton County, they've been talking about it for years. But if when I was a kid, there were 4 elementary schools plus a couple of, at least one middle school, and then the high school plus Tri-Central. Now they're talking about maybe just going to one school. It's 260 square miles. I mean, we're going to have a lot of kids on buses all day. Um, I want to go back to these fundamental issues, because I think it goes beyond the finer tuning of government, which is, I think, some of the urban versus rural issues. But education is important for both groups. Healthcare is important for both groups, and having good small business is definitely important to both groups.
What are your thoughts on right to repair bills?
I think it's brilliant. I think the idea of planned obsolescence is frankly one of the downfalls of America. That might be too dramatic, but if you grew up like I did, your grandparents had a refrigerator that maybe was not super healthy to produce, but it lasted for 30 years. I just built a house in 2021 and my brand new KitchenAid refrigerator already has ice machine issues. It hasn't even been in use for 4 years. I think that we not only need to have a right to repair strategy, but we also need to hold companies accountable for putting out products that's quality.
Nate, we've talked about priorities, policy, and the realities facing District 38. Now we're going to switch gears. This is the hold 'em or fold 'em round. It's going to give you a statement or a proposal. You tell me whether you hold 'em, meaning you support it, or fold 'em, meaning you don't. No long speeches, no hedging. Voters deserve to know where candidates draw lines. Let's do it. Fully funding Indiana public schools without vouchers, siphoning money away from rural districts.
Hold them.
Raising teacher pay statewide to keep educators from leaving small town schools.
Hold them.
Expanding broadband as essential infrastructure, not a luxury in rural communities like Camden, Flora, and Galveston.
Hold them.
Protecting local hospitals and expanding access to rural healthcare services.
Hold them.
Allowing Hoosier women and their doctors, not politicians, to make medical decisions.
Hold them for sure.
Increasing transparency in the state house so voters can clearly see who's funding legislation.
Hold them.
Common sense gun safety measures that respect the Second Amendment while reducing gun violence.
Hold them.
Holding your own party accountable when it gets something wrong.
Hold them.
I want to thank Nate Stout for sitting down with me today. These conversations matter, especially in districts like the 38th, where politics isn't theoretical, it's personal. It's about schools staying open, hospitals staying staffed, roads staying passable, whether people feel seen by the folks making decisions in Indianapolis. You don't have to agree with a candidate on every issue to respect clarity, preparation, and willingness to show up and answer questions directly. Nate did that today. That's what voters deserve, not perfection, not sound bites, but honesty and a clear sense of priorities. At the end of the day, representation isn't about party labels. It's about who's willing to listen and who's willing to learn and who's willing to be accountable when the job gets hard. To the voters of District 38, the work doesn't end with interviews like this. So stay informed, ask questions, and as always, hold them accountable.